They called her a useless, barren midwife who couldn't even birth her own child, until an Apache chief rode into the hostile frontier town of Red Mesa with his dying son in his arms, looked past every other healer, and placed his boy's life in the hands of the woman everyone else had given up on. The sun blazed mercilessly over the dusty streets of Red Mesa, casting harsh shadows between the weathered wooden buildings that lined the main thoroughfare. Heat shimmered off the packed earth like liquid silver, and the air hung thick with the scent of sage, horse sweat, and the perpetual dust that seemed to coat everything in this God-forsaken corner of the Arizona Territory. Grace Morgan wiped the perspiration from her brow as she stepped out of Martinez General Store, her worn leather medical bag clutched tightly in her weathered hands. At 34, Grace possessed the kind of quiet strength that comes from years of bringing life into a world that seemed determined to snuff it out. Her auburn hair, streaked with premature silver, was pulled back in a practical bun beneath her wide-brimmed hat, and her calico dress, though mended in several places, was always immaculately clean. She had learned long ago that in her profession, cleanliness could mean the difference between life and death, though the people of Red Mesa seemed more concerned with other aspects of her character. The wooden sidewalk creaked under her boots as she made her way toward the edge of town, where old Mrs. Patterson waited in labor, with what would likely be her final child. Grace had delivered 7 of the woman's previous 8 children, losing only 1 to the fever that swept through Red Mesa 3 winters ago. Yet even Mrs. Patterson, despite Grace's proven skill, had requested that Grace find someone else to attend this birth. "Grace Morgan, you hold up there," came a sharp voice from behind her. Grace turned to see Reverend Blackwood striding toward her, his black coat somehow pristine despite the heat, his thin face set in the perpetual expression of disapproval that seemed reserved especially for her. Behind him followed Mayor Caldwell, Sheriff Morrison, and Dr. Hamilton, the only other medical practitioner in Red Mesa, though his medical degree from a correspondence school in Kansas hardly qualified him to treat anything more serious than a hangover. "Reverend," Grace acknowledged with a slight nod, her voice carrying the weary patience of someone who had endured this conversation countless times before. "I'm needed at the Patterson place. Mrs. Patterson's labor has begun, and Mrs. Patterson has reconsidered," Dr. Hamilton interrupted, stepping forward with the smug confidence of a man who had never doubted his place in the world. "She's asked me to attend the birth instead. A woman in her condition needs proper medical care, not the fumbling of someone who couldn't even carry her own child to term." The words hit Grace like a physical blow, though she had heard variations of them whispered behind her back for nearly a decade. She had been 19 when she married Thomas Morgan, 20 when she first felt the flutter of life within her womb, and 21 when she buried the tiny son who had lived for only 3 hours after a difficult birth. 2 more pregnancies had followed, each ending in heartbreak, until Thomas finally left her for a younger woman who could give him the sons he desperately wanted. "Dr. Hamilton," Grace said quietly, her voice steady, despite the pain that those words always brought. "I have successfully delivered 143 children in this territory. 47 of those births were complicated cases that required surgical intervention. I have lost only 4 children and 2 mothers in all that time. Your record, I believe, stands at 12 children lost and 7 mothers in just 2 years of practice." Dr. Hamilton's face flushed red above his carefully waxed mustache. "Those deaths were due to complications beyond medical control. You, madam, are not even a real doctor. You're a barren woman playing at medicine, bringing bad luck to every birth you attend. The good people of Red Mesa have finally come to their senses." Sheriff Morrison, a heavy-set man with kind eyes who had always treated Grace with grudging respect, shifted uncomfortably. "Now, Dr. Hamilton, let's not what, Sheriff?" Mayor Caldwell interjected, his political instincts telling him which way the wind was blowing in Red Mesa. Let's not acknowledge that we have a woman practicing medicine without proper credentials, a woman who has never successfully birthed a child of her own. The territorial government is cracking down on unqualified practitioners. And frankly, I think it's time Red Mesa cleaned house. Grace felt the familiar weight of isolation settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. This was not the first time her qualifications had been questioned, nor would it be the last. She had learned midwifery from her grandmother, who had learned it from her grandmother before her, passing down generations of knowledge about herbs, anatomy, and the delicate art of coaxing life into the world. She had studied every medical text she could get her hands on, practicing surgical techniques on animal carcasses, learning to read the subtle signs that could mean the difference between a successful birth and a tragedy. "I see," Grace said, quietly, her green eyes moving from face to face, seeing in each the same mixture of suspicion and dismissal she had grown accustomed to. "And I suppose this decision has nothing to do with Dr. Hamilton's generous contributions to the church building fund, or his promise to Mayor Caldwell that he would support the mayor's bid for territorial representative." Reverend Blackwood drew himself up to his full height, his eyes flashing with righteous indignation. "How dare you suggest that money would influence our spiritual guidance to this community? This decision is based purely on moral and medical grounds. A woman who cannot fulfill her own biological destiny has no business meddling in the sacred act of birth." The cruel irony was not lost on Grace. Here she stood, a woman who had devoted her life to bringing other people's children safely into the world, being condemned for her inability to bear children of her own. She thought of the countless nights she had spent at bedsides, holding the hands of frightened mothers, talking them through the pain, using her knowledge to save lives when everything seemed lost. She thought of the mothers who had wept with gratitude when she placed healthy babies in their arms, and the fathers who had shaken her hand with tears in their eyes. "I understand," Grace said finally, her voice carrying a dignity that seemed to shame even Dr. Hamilton. "I'll pack my things and be on the morning stage to Tucson. Perhaps the territorial hospital there will have need of someone with my experience." As Grace turned to walk away, the sound of thundering hoofbeats echoed down Main Street. The small group turned to see a cloud of dust approaching from the east, and within moments a single rider came into view. Even at a distance, there was no mistaking the proud bearing and the distinctive war paint that marked him as Apache. The townspeople scattered like startled chickens, doors slamming shut and windows closing as word spread through Red Mesa like wildfire. Chief Delche rode a magnificent paint stallion, his long black hair flowing behind him as he navigated his horse through the now empty street. He was a man in his 40s, tall and lean, with the weathered face of someone who had spent his life under the desert sun. Across his lap, wrapped in a colorful blanket, lay a young boy who could not have been more than 13 years old. Even from a distance, Grace could see the dark stain spreading across the blanket, blood, and a lot of it. The Apache chief brought his horse to a stop directly in front of the small group of town leaders, his dark eyes surveying each face with the calculating gaze of a predator. When his eyes fell on Grace, something passed between them, a recognition perhaps, or simply the acknowledgement of one healer by another. Chief Delche had heard stories of the white woman who delivered babies with gentle hands and healing knowledge, though he had never seen her before this moment. "I seek the woman who brings life," Chief Delche said in heavily accented English, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "My son bleeds inside. Your medicine man cannot help." Dr. Hamilton stepped forward, puffing out his chest with self-importance. "I am the doctor here, Chief. If you're looking for medical assistance, I'm the qualified practitioner." Chief Delche's gaze moved to Dr. Hamilton with barely concealed contempt. "You are the one who let 3 Apache children die when the spotted sickness came to our people 2 summers ago. You gave them white man's poison that made them sicker. I do not trust you with my son's life." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Grace remembered that epidemic well. She had wanted to help, had even prepared medicines that she knew could ease the symptoms. But Dr. Hamilton had forbidden her from treating the Apache children, claiming that his mercury-based treatments were the only appropriate medicine for civilized people to use. Those children had died in agony while Grace was forced to stand by, helplessly. Chief Delshay's attention returned to Grace, and she found herself looking into eyes that held a mixture of desperation and iron determination. "You are the woman who delivered the Mexican trader's wife when she carried twins and nearly died. You saved both babies and the mother when your medicine man said they would all perish. I have heard Apache women speak your name with respect." Grace felt a chill run down her spine, despite the oppressive heat. She had indeed delivered Maria Gonzalez's twins the previous spring, working for nearly 20 hours to turn one of the breached babies and stop the hemorrhaging that threatened to kill the mother. It had been one of her most challenging cases, requiring surgical precision and intimate knowledge of anatomy that few practitioners in the territory possessed. That Apache women had heard of her work and spoken of it with approval was both surprising and deeply moving. "Chief Delshay," she said carefully, aware that every word could have life or death consequences, not just for his son, but potentially for everyone in Red Mesa. "I would be honored to examine your son, but I must warn you, if his injuries are as severe as they appear, I may not be able to save him." The Apache chief nodded grimly. "He was thrown from his horse during a hunt. A sharp rock pierced his side, and the bleeding will not stop. Our medicine man has done what he can, but he says the boy needs different healing now. He told me to seek the white woman who understands the body's secrets." Dr. Hamilton sputtered with indignation. "This is preposterous. Chief, you can't possibly trust this woman over a trained physician. She has no medical degree, no formal education." "Silence," Chief Delshay commanded, his voice cutting through Dr. Hamilton's protests like a knife. "I have seen the results of your education. My son will not die because of your pride." Reverend Blackwood stepped forward, his face pale with worry about the political implications of the situation. "Chief Delshay, surely we can come to some arrangement. Dr. Hamilton is perfectly capable." "Your medicine man had his chance with my people," the chief replied, his tone final. "Now I choose my son's healer. Woman who brings life, will you help my boy, or must I watch him die while you argue among yourselves?" Grace looked down at the bundle in Chief Delshay's arms and saw a trickle of bright red blood seeping through the blanket. The boy's breathing was shallow and rapid, his face pale despite his naturally dark complexion. Every instinct she possessed told her that time was running out, that whatever decision was made needed to be made quickly. The irony of the situation was not lost on her. Here were the very people who had just finished condemning her as unfit to practice medicine, watching as an Apache chief specifically requested her services over those of their qualified doctor. Here was validation of her skills coming from the most unexpected source. A man whose people had every reason to distrust any white settler, yet who was willing to entrust his son's life to her care. "I'll need a clean, well-lit place to work," Grace said, her decision made. "My cabin has the best light and my instruments are there. If you're willing to trust me, Chief Delshay, I'll do everything in my power to save your son." The Apache chief nodded once, sharply. "I trust you, woman who brings life. Lead the way." As Grace began walking toward her cabin at the edge of town, she could hear the urgent whispered conversation behind her. Mayor Caldwell's voice carried clearly in the still air. "This is a disaster waiting to happen. If that boy dies, Delshay will blame the whole town. And if he lives, what does that say about our medical standards?" Dr. Hamilton's voice was equally agitated. "We cannot allow this precedent to stand, an unqualified woman treating Apache royalty. The territorial governor will have questions, but Grace was no longer listening to their concerns. Her mind had shifted into the focused calm that always came over her when lives hung in the balance. She mentally inventoried her supplies: clean linens, surgical instruments, the precious bottle of laudanum she kept for the most serious cases, the various herbs and tinctures that her grandmother had taught her to prepare. Whatever Chief Delche's son needed, she would provide. As they reached her small cabin, Grace could see curious faces peering out from behind curtains and partially open doors. The sight of an Apache chief riding through Red Mesa with his wounded son was unprecedented, and the fact that he had chosen Grace over the town's official doctor would be the subject of heated discussion for months to come. But for now, all that mattered was the young boy whose life hung by a thread. Grace opened her door and gestured for Chief Delche to enter. The interior of her cabin was simple but scrupulously clean, with a large table near the window that she used for her most delicate work. Shelves lined the walls, filled with carefully labeled jars of medicines, surgical instruments gleaming in their cases, and stacks of clean linens that she boiled and dried regularly. "Place him here," Grace instructed, indicating the table. "And Chief Delche, this is going to be difficult for both of you. Are you prepared for what might happen?" The Apache chief looked at her with eyes that had seen too much death and loss. "I am prepared for my son to live, because you will. Save him. That is why I came to you instead of letting him die in our camp. You have reputation among my people, reputation for fighting death and winning." As Chief Delche gently placed his son on the table, Grace got her first clear look at the boy's injuries. The sight made her stomach clench with worry, but she kept her expression calm and professional. This would indeed be the fight of her life, not just for the boy's survival, but for her own reputation, and possibly for the fragile peace between Red Mesa and the Apache people. Outside, she could hear the murmur of gathering voices as word spread through the town. Soon, half of Red Mesa would be clustered around her cabin, waiting to see whether the Barren Midwife they had rejected could succeed where their qualified doctor might have failed. The pressure was enormous, but Grace had learned long ago to channel pressure into precision. She looked at Chief Delche, then down at his wounded son, and made a silent promise. Today, she would prove once and for all that skill mattered more than credentials, that knowledge earned through experience was worth more than degrees bought with money, and that sometimes the most unlikely healers were exactly what desperate situations required. Grace's hands moved with practiced efficiency as she lit every oil lamp in her cabin, transforming the small space into an operating theater bathed in golden light. The August heat seemed to intensify inside the closed room, but she needed maximum visibility for what lay ahead. Chief Delche stood silently beside the table where his son lay motionless, the boy's breathing growing more labored with each passing minute. "What is his name?" Grace asked, as she began laying out her surgical instruments on a clean white cloth. Her voice remained calm and professional, though her heart hammered against her ribs as she assessed the severity of the wounds beneath the blood-soaked blanket. "Ponce," Chief Delche replied, his weathered hand resting gently on his son's forehead. "It means leader in your language. He was born during the season of the summer storms, when lightning split the sky and brought rain after many months of drought. The medicine man said he would bring change to our people." Grace nodded as she carefully peeled back the blanket, revealing the extent of Ponce's injuries for the first time. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat, though she managed to keep her expression neutral. A jagged wound ran along the boy's left side, beginning just below his ribcage and extending nearly to his hip. The edges were torn, rather than cut clean, suggesting that the rock that had caused the injury had been both sharp and roughly textured. More concerning than the external wound, however, were the signs of internal bleeding that Grace recognized. Immediately, Ponce's abdomen was distended and hard to the touch. His skin had taken on a greyish pallor, and when Grace pressed gently along his side, she could feel the telltale rigidity that indicated blood pooling in his abdominal cavity. "This was far more serious than a simple flesh wound, Chief Delche," Grace said quietly, meeting the Apache leader's intense gaze. "Your son has internal injuries that are beyond what most healers could treat. The rock that wounded him has damaged organs inside his body, and he is bleeding internally. I need to operate immediately, or he will die within the hour." The chief's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "What must you do?" Grace began washing her hands in a basin of hot water that she kept perpetually ready for emergencies, scrubbing with the harsh lye soap that she had learned would prevent the infection that killed more patients than their original injuries. "I need to open his abdomen and find the source of the bleeding. If an organ is damaged, I may be able to repair it. If a blood vessel is severed, I can tie it off. But Chief Delche," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "this surgery has never been attempted on someone so young, and even if everything goes perfectly, he may not survive." Outside the cabin, Grace could hear the murmur of gathering voices as word of the Apache chief's presence spread through Red Mesa like wildfire. She could distinguish Mayor Caldwell's agitated tones and Dr. Hamilton's pompous pronouncements, but she forced herself to block out the external distractions. Nothing mattered now except the dying boy on her table. Chief Delche studied his son's pale face for a long moment, then looked back at Grace with eyes that held both desperate hope and grim acceptance. "In our tribe, we have a saying. The eagle does not ask the canyon for permission to soar. You are the eagle, woman who brings life. Soar." Grace felt a surge of responsibility unlike anything she had ever experienced. This was not just about saving one boy's life. This was about proving that skill and knowledge mattered more than prejudice and credentials. This was about showing the people of Red Mesa that the woman they had dismissed as a barren failure possessed abilities that their certified doctor could never match. She began preparing her anesthesia, carefully measuring drops of laudanum into a clean cloth. "Chief Delche, I need you to hold this over Ponce's nose and mouth when I tell you. It will make him sleep so he won't feel pain during the surgery. But you must keep your hands steady. Too much, and he won't wake up. Too little, and he'll wake up." During the operation, the Apache chief took the cloth with the same careful attention he might give to handling a sacred ceremonial object. "I understand. His life is in our hands now." Grace had performed abdominal surgery only twice before, both times on adults whose injuries had been less severe than Ponce's. The first patient had survived. The second had died from infection 3 days later. Despite the successful repair of his wounds, the anatomy of a 13-year-old boy would be different, more delicate, requiring even greater precision than usual. She picked up her scalpel, its blade gleaming in the lamplight, and took a deep breath. "Begin with the anesthesia," she instructed Chief Delche. As the boy's breathing deepened and his body relaxed into unconsciousness, Grace made her first incision. The surgery that followed was unlike anything Grace had ever attempted. Working by the light of oil lamps, with sweat dripping down her face despite the cloth bandana she had tied around her forehead, she carefully opened Ponce's abdomen and began searching for the source of the internal bleeding. What she found confirmed her worst fears. The jagged rock had not only torn through muscle and skin, but had also punctured his spleen and nicked a major blood vessel. "How much blood has he lost?" Chief Delche asked quietly, his voice steady, despite the gruesome nature of what he was witnessing. "Too much," Grace replied honestly, as she worked to control the hemorrhaging. "But not so much that we can't save him, if we work quickly." Using techniques she had learned from studying surgical manuals and adapted through necessity during her years of frontier practice, Grace began the delicate process of repairing the damaged spleen. The organ was small in a boy Ponce's age, barely the size of her fist, but it bled profusely when damaged. She would need to remove the most severely damaged portion while preserving enough healthy tissue to maintain the organ's function. The procedure required absolute concentration and steady hands. One wrong cut, one moment of hesitation, and the boy would bleed to death on her table. Grace found herself falling into the almost meditative state that came over her during the most challenging births, when every decision could mean the difference between life and death for both mother and child. As she worked, Grace became dimly aware of voices outside growing louder and more agitated. Through her small window, she could see that a crowd had gathered in front of her cabin. Not just the curious townspeople, but what appeared to be several Apache warriors who had followed their chief to Red Mesa. The situation was becoming increasingly volatile with each passing minute. "Chief Delche," Grace said without looking up from her work, "are those your men outside?" The Apache leader glanced toward the window, his expression grim. "My brother Nietzsche and 4 of our best warriors. They followed me to ensure I would not be harmed by your people. They are also here to witness whether the white woman can save my son's life." Grace felt her stomach clench with additional pressure. Not only was she fighting to save Ponce's life, but the outcome of her surgery could potentially affect the fragile peace between Red Mesa and the Apache tribe. If the boy died, his uncle and the other warriors might well blame the townspeople for allowing an incompetent healer to treat their chief's son. She pushed these concerns from her mind and focused on the intricate work before her. The damaged section of spleen had been successfully removed, and she was now working to repair the blood vessel that had been nicked by the rock. This required sutures finer than human hair, placed with absolute precision to ensure that the vessel would hold under pressure without being constricted. "His color is improving," Chief Delche observed, and Grace looked up to see that he was right. The grayish pallor was fading from Ponce's face, and his breathing seemed less labored. "The bleeding is under control," Grace confirmed, feeling the first stirring of hope since the surgery had begun. "Now I need to clean the wound thoroughly and close the incision. The real danger now is infection. If bacteria gets into the wound, all of our work will be for nothing." She had learned about bacterial infection from reading the latest medical journals that occasionally made their way to the frontier, though the concept was still controversial among many practitioners. Dr. Hamilton had actually mocked her for her obsession with cleanliness, claiming that fresh air and bloodletting were the only treatments necessary for most ailments, using a solution of carbolic acid that she had ordered from a medical supply company in Denver. Grace thoroughly irrigated the wound cavity before beginning the careful process of closing the incision. Each suture had to be placed precisely. Too tight, and the tissue would tear; too loose, and the wound would reopen. The delicate work took nearly an hour, during which the voices outside grew steadily more agitated. Grace could hear Dr. Hamilton pontificating about the dangers of allowing unqualified practitioners to treat serious injuries, while Mayor Caldwell worried aloud about the political ramifications of the situation. Most concerning, however, were the angry voices of some townspeople who seemed to view the presence of Apache warriors as a threat that needed to be addressed. "Woman who brings life," Chief Delche said quietly. "My brother grows impatient. He fears that harm may come to me while I am separated from my warriors. Perhaps you could speak to your people, tell them that we mean no harm." Grace looked up from her suturing, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. "Chief Delche, I'm afraid my people don't listen to me any more than your people would listen to someone they considered an outsider. But if your brother is concerned, perhaps he could come inside and see that you and Ponce are safe." The Apache chief considered this suggestion for a moment, then nodded. "Nietzsche is a good man, but he has seen much treachery from white settlers. He will be suspicious, but he will also see that you work to save my son." Chief Delche moved to the window and spoke in rapid Apache to the warriors outside. A moment later, the cabin door opened and a man entered who was clearly Delche's brother. The family resemblance was unmistakable, though Naiche was younger and carried himself with the coiled tension of a man perpetually ready for battle. Naiche's dark eyes swept the cabin, taking in the surgical instruments, the clean linens, and most importantly, his nephew lying unconscious on the table. When his gaze fell on Grace, she saw a mixture of skepticism and grudging respect. "You are smaller than I expected," Naiche said, in accented but clear English. "The stories speak of a medicine woman with great power." "I'm not a medicine woman," Grace replied, continuing her suturing without pause. "I'm a midwife who has learned to treat injuries when necessary. Your nephew is very sick, but I believe he will live." Naiche moved closer to the table, studying his nephew's face and the professional manner in which Grace was treating the wound. "You work differently than the other white medicine man. Your hands are gentle, your tools are clean, and you do not seem afraid." "I am afraid," Grace admitted quietly. "I'm terrified that I might make a mistake and lose your nephew's life. But fear can make you careful, and being careful might save him." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. As Grace placed the final sutures and began bandaging the wound, she became aware that the voices outside had grown much louder and more hostile. Through the window, she could see that Sheriff Morrison was trying to maintain order among a crowd of perhaps 50 townspeople, while Dr. Hamilton stood on a wooden crate, gesticulating wildly as he addressed the gathering. "What is he saying?" Chief Delche asked, his own tension increasing as he sensed the mood of the crowd. Grace listened carefully, her heart sinking as she made out Dr. Hamilton's words. "This woman has no business treating anyone, let alone the son of a savage. Chief, if that boy dies, do you think his father will blame her? No, he'll blame all of us for allowing it to happen. We need to take control of this situation before it's too late." The crowd's response was immediate and ugly, with voices calling for Grace to be removed from the situation and for Dr. Hamilton to take over the case. Some voices even suggested that the Apache warriors should be disarmed and escorted out of town. Naiche's hand moved instinctively to the knife at his belt, and Grace could see the dangerous tension building in the small cabin. "Chief Delche," she said urgently, "we need to let people know that the surgery was successful, that Ponce is going to recover. Otherwise, this situation could get very bad very quickly." The Apache chief looked at his son, who was beginning to stir as the effects of the laudanum wore off. Then at his brother, whose face was set in grim lines of preparation for battle. "What do you suggest?" Grace finished securing the bandage and stepped back from the table, surveying her work with professional satisfaction. The incision was closed cleanly. The bleeding had stopped completely, and Ponce's color was returning to normal. "I suggest we show them that you trusted the right person with your son's life." As if summoned by her words, Ponce's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, but gradually clearing as he became aware of his surroundings. "Father," he whispered. In Apache, his voice weak but unmistakably alive. Chief Delche leaned over his son, speaking softly in their native language, while Naiche moved to the other side of the table. The reunion was quietly emotional, and Grace felt tears prick her eyes as she watched the relief flood over both men's faces. "The surgery was successful," Grace announced, loud enough for her voice to carry through the thin cabin walls to the crowd outside. "Ponce's injuries have been repaired, and he should make a full recovery with proper rest and care." The effect on the crowd outside was immediate. The angry voices faltered, replaced by surprised murmurs and confused discussions. Dr. Hamilton's voice rose above the others, demanding to examine the patient himself to verify the results. But Chief Delshay's response was swift and definitive. "No one else touches my son," the Apache chief declared, moving protectively closer to the table. "The woman who brings life has proven her skill. We will not risk my boy's health to satisfy your doubts." As Grace began cleaning up her surgical instruments, she realized that everything had changed in the space of a few hours. The people of Red Mesa had watched an Apache chief choose her over their certified doctor, had witnessed her successfully perform surgery that Dr. Hamilton would never have attempted, and had seen the results speak for themselves. But she also knew that this was only the beginning. The real test would come in the days ahead, as Ponce recovered from his surgery and the full implications of what had happened began to sink in among the townspeople. For now, though, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction as she watched the young Apache boy speak softly with his father and uncle, alive and recovering thanks to skills that no one in Red Mesa had wanted to acknowledge. 3 days had passed since Grace's surgery saved Ponce's life, and the boy's recovery had exceeded even her most optimistic expectations. The Apache camp that Chief Delshay had established in the Cottonwood Grove beside Willow Creek, just 2 miles from Red Mesa, had become an unexpected bridge between two worlds that had previously existed in mutual suspicion and hostility. Grace rode her old mare through the morning mist toward the Apache camp, her medical bag secured behind her saddle and a basket of fresh bread balanced on her lap. A gift from Maria Santos, the Mexican baker's wife, who had quietly approached Grace the evening before. Word of Ponce's miraculous recovery had spread far beyond Red Mesa, reaching the Hispanic families who worked the outlying ranches and the handful of prospectors who scraped for silver in the nearby foothills. As Grace approached the camp, she marveled at the transformation that had taken place. What had begun as a small group of Apache warriors waiting anxiously for news of their chief's son had evolved into something resembling a peaceful trading post. Several families from the reservation had made the journey to visit Chief Delshay, bringing with them beautifully woven baskets, turquoise jewelry, and carved wooden items that they were quietly trading with curious townspeople brave enough to venture beyond Red Mesa's protective boundaries. The camp itself was a testament to Apache skill and efficiency. Covered wiki-ups had been erected in a careful pattern that provided both privacy and security, while a central fire pit served as the heart of community life. Children played with simple toys carved from wood and bone, their laughter mixing with the quiet conversations of adults and the soft sounds of daily camp life. Ponce sat propped against a backrest made of woven willow branches, his young face still pale but animated as he spoke with his father and several other Apache men. When he saw Grace approaching, his face lit up with the kind of smile that made all the risk she had taken seem worthwhile. "Woman who brings life," Ponce called out in carefully practiced English, using the name that had apparently stuck among the Apache people. "I have been telling my cousins about your magic knives that chase away death." Grace dismounted and approached the group with the respectful caution she had learned was appropriate when entering Apache social spaces. "Good morning, Ponce. How are you feeling today?" Chief Delshay rose from his place beside the fire and gestured for Grace to join their circle. "His strength returns like the sun after a storm. Your healing was thorough and true." As Grace settled onto a beautifully woven mat that someone had placed for her, she noticed several Apache women watching from nearby wiki-ups. Their expressions were curious rather than hostile, and she recognized the universal look of mothers evaluating someone who had proven skill in medical matters. "Chief Delshay," Grace said, accepting a cup of pine needle tea from an elderly Apache woman who nodded approvingly at her. "I've been wondering about something Ponce mentioned yesterday. He said your medicine man told you to seek the white woman who understands the body's secrets. How did he know about my work?" The chief's weathered face creased into something approaching a smile. "Wisdom comes from many sources, woman who brings life. Our medicine man, Geronimo's cousin, has great power to see things that others cannot. But he also listens to the Mexican women who work in the white settlements, and they speak of a healer who brings babies safely into the world. When others would give up..." Grace felt a warm flush of pride at this unexpected recognition of her work. She had delivered dozens of children for the Hispanic families who lived on the outskirts of the territory, often working for payment in the form of food, cloth, or simple gratitude. She had never realized that her reputation had spread into Apache circles. An older Apache woman approached their group, moving with the careful dignity of someone accustomed to being treated with respect. Chief Delche immediately stood and gestured for Grace to do the same. "This is my mother, White Dove," he said formally. "She wishes to speak with you about woman matters." White Dove studied Grace with intelligent dark eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of her appearance and demeanor. When she spoke, it was in accented but clear English, her voice carrying the authority of age and wisdom. "You saved my grandson's life when our own medicine could not help him. This creates a debt between our peoples that must be acknowledged properly. But first, I would know more about the woman who cuts into bodies without fear and makes healing where others see only death." Grace found herself being gently but firmly guided away from the men's circle toward a group of Apache women who had gathered around their own fire. As she settled among them, she realized she was being given an extraordinary opportunity to learn about Apache culture from the women's perspective. "In our tribe," White Dove continued, "healing knowledge is passed from grandmother to granddaughter, mother to daughter, through many generations. Each woman learns the secrets of plants, the mysteries of childbirth, the ways to fight sickness and injury. You say you learned from your grandmother also." Grace nodded, touched by the parallels between their traditions. "My grandmother was a midwife in Ireland before she came to America. She taught me that every birth is a battle between life and death, and that the healer's job is to tip the balance toward life." A younger Apache woman with intricate tattoos on her hands leaned forward with obvious interest. "You have delivered many children." "More than 200, Grace replied, then hesitated before adding, "though I have never been able to carry my own children to term." The admission brought unexpected nods of understanding rather than the judgment she had grown accustomed to in Red Mesa. White Dove reached out and touched Grace's hand gently. "Among our people, we believe that some women are chosen by the spirits to be guardians of other women's children. These women sacrifice their own motherhood so that they can serve the greater need. It is a sacred calling, not a failure." Grace felt tears prick her eyes at this completely different interpretation of her childlessness. In Red Mesa, her inability to bear children was seen as evidence of her unworthiness to help others give birth. Among the Apache women, it was being reframed as a spiritual calling. The conversation that followed was unlike any Grace had ever experienced. The Apache women shared their knowledge of medicinal plants native to the desert, while Grace described surgical techniques she had learned from medical journals and adapted through necessity. They compared notes on difficult births, comparing the challenges of delivering babies in wickiups versus frontier cabins. "There is a plant that grows near the sacred springs," White Dove said thoughtfully. "We call it woman's friend because it helps stop bleeding after difficult births. Your people do not know of this plant, but perhaps they should." Grace listened intently as the elderly woman described the plant's appearance, preparation, and uses. This was knowledge that could save lives, the kind of practical wisdom that no medical school taught, but that frontier healers desperately needed. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Grace looked up to see Sheriff Morrison riding toward the camp, accompanied by Mayor Caldwell, Dr. Hamilton, and surprisingly, Reverend Blackwood. The expressions on their faces suggested that this was not a friendly social visit. Chief Delchay rose from the men's circle and walked out to meet the newcomers, his posture polite but wary. Grace could hear his voice carrying across the camp. As he greeted the town officials, "Sheriff Morrison, you are welcome in our camp. How may we help you?" Sheriff Morrison dismounted, his hand resting casually on his gun belt in a gesture that was probably unconscious but definitely noted by every Apache warrior in the camp. "Chief Delchay, we've come to discuss the situation. And that's developed here. The territorial governor has expressed concerns about unauthorized medical treatment and irregular relationships between settlers and tribal peoples." Grace felt her stomach clench with apprehension. She had expected that her success in treating Ponce would create complications, but she had hoped for more time before the political machinery began grinding into motion. Dr. Hamilton pushed forward, his face flushed with indignation and something else, a fear perhaps, that his professional reputation was being undermined by Grace's obvious competence. "Chief Delchay, I must insist on examining the boy myself. Proper medical protocols require that any surgical procedure be verified by a licensed physician." The Apache chief's response was swift and definitive. "My son was dying when you refused to help him. The woman who brings life saved his life. With her skill and courage, I will not risk his health to satisfy your curiosity." Mayor Caldwell stepped forward with the oily diplomacy that had served him well in territorial politics. "Chief Delchay, surely you understand our position. Miss Morgan is not a licensed physician. If word reaches the territorial capital that we're allowing unqualified practitioners to perform surgery, there could be serious legal consequences for everyone involved." Grace rose from her place among the Apache women and walked toward the confrontation, aware that every eye in the camp was following her movement. She had known this moment would come, but she hadn't expected it to arrive so soon or in such a public manner. "Gentlemen," she said calmly, "I appreciate your concern for proper procedures, but Ponce was dying, and I had the skills necessary to save his life. Are you suggesting that I should have let him die rather than risk violating territorial medical regulations?" Reverend Blackwood, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward with the righteous authority that he wielded so effectively from his pulpit. "Miss Morgan, you have placed this entire community in an impossible position. Your actions, however well-intentioned, have created a dangerous precedent. What happens when other tribal members demand medical treatment from unqualified practitioners?" Chief Delchay's eyes flashed with anger at the implication that his people were somehow a threat to the community. "Reverend, my people have survived in this land for countless generations without your medicine. We sought help from the woman who brings life because our own medicine man recognized that this injury required different healing. We did not demand anything. We asked and she answered with courage and skill." The tension in the camp was palpable now, with Apache warriors moving subtly into defensive positions while the townspeople clustered together near their horses. Grace realized that this confrontation could escalate into violence very quickly if someone didn't find a way to diffuse the situation. "Perhaps," Grace said carefully, "there's a solution that addresses everyone's concerns. Chief Delchay, would you be willing to allow Dr. Hamilton to examine Ponce's healing progress, not to question my treatment, but to verify that the boy is recovering properly?" Dr. Hamilton puffed up with self-importance at this suggestion. "That would be the appropriate medical protocol, yes." But Chief Delchay shook his head firmly. "The white medicine man had his chance to help my son, and he refused. I will not allow him to touch Ponce now. White Dove, who had been listening to the exchange with growing displeasure, stood and walked toward the group of officials. Her presence immediately commanded attention, and even Dr. Hamilton fell silent as she approached. I am White Dove, mother of Chief Delche and grandmother of the boy whose life was saved. In our tribe, I am a woman of standing and authority. I have something to say to the white leaders. The elderly Apache woman drew herself up to her full height and fixed each of the town officials with a stare that seemed to see straight through to their souls. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades of experience and wisdom. You speak of dangerous precedents and proper procedures, but you ignore the most important truth. Your qualified medicine man was willing to let a child die. Rather than admit his limitations, the woman who brings life was willing to risk everything to save a life. Which of these actions serves your God better? The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel, and Grace could see that even Reverend Blackwood was struggling to find an appropriate response. The moral dimensions of the situation had just been laid bare in a way that made political concerns seem petty and self-serving. Sheriff Morrison, who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, attempted to regain control of the situation. Ma'am, with all due respect, this isn't about moral judgments. It's about legal requirements and public safety. Public safety. Chief Delche's voice carried a dangerous edge now. Sheriff, my son is alive and healing because of the woman. You want to punish for saving his life. Where was your concern for public safety when your medicine man refused to help a dying child? Grace could see that the situation was spiraling toward a confrontation that could have serious consequences for everyone involved. The Apache warriors were clearly prepared to defend their chief and his family, while the townspeople were beginning to back toward their horses with the nervous energy of people who suddenly realized they might be in over their heads. Chief Delche, Grace said quietly, perhaps it would be best if I return to town with these gentlemen. We can discuss this situation calmly without putting your people at risk. The Apache chief turned to her with an expression of genuine surprise. You would leave when your healing work is not yet finished? Ponce still needs daily care, and my people have much to learn from your knowledge. Grace looked around the camp, taking in the faces of the Apache women who had welcomed her so warmly, the children who had begun to greet her with shy smiles, and most importantly, Ponce, whose young face showed concern as he watched the adults argue about his treatment. My work here is not finished, she said finally, her voice carrying across the camp with surprising strength. Ponce needs continued medical care, and I intend to provide it. Gentlemen, if you have legal concerns about my actions, I suggest you take them up with the territorial authorities. Until then, I have a patient to care for. The boldness of her statement surprised everyone, including Grace herself. She had just publicly declared her intention to continue treating Ponce despite official disapproval, effectively challenging the authority of both the town leaders and territorial medical regulations. Dr. Hamilton's face turned an alarming shade of purple. This is outrageous. Miss Morgan, you are practicing medicine without a license, treating patients without proper oversight, and now you're refusing to submit to legitimate medical authority. Dr. Hamilton, Grace replied with a calm that she didn't entirely feel. I'm providing medical care to a patient who would have died without my intervention. If you believe that constitutes a crime, I suggest you file charges and let a territorial judge decide. The gauntlet had been thrown down, and everyone in the camp understood the implications. Grace had just forced the town officials to either take legal action against her or acknowledge that her treatment of Ponce had been both necessary and successful. As the confrontation reached its climax, Grace realized that she had crossed a line from which there would be no return. She was no longer just the rejected midwife of Red Mesa. She had become something new, something that threatened the established order and demanded to be reckoned with on her own terms. 2 weeks after Grace's confrontation with the town officials, the fragile peace between Red Mesa and Chief Delche's camp was shattered by an event that no one had anticipated. The trouble began at dawn on a Tuesday morning when young Billy Hutchins, the mayor's 12-year-old son, failed to return from his overnight fishing expedition to Willow Creek, the same waterway that ran past the Apache camp. Grace was tending to Ponce's nearly healed wounds when the sound of galloping horses and shouting voices carried across the desert from the direction of town. Within minutes, a dust cloud on the horizon revealed a large group of armed men riding hard toward the Apache camp, their intentions unmistakably hostile. "Trouble comes," Chief Delche said grimly, rising from his place beside the morning fire. Around the camp, Apache warriors moved with fluid efficiency, gathering weapons and positioning themselves defensively, while women began securing children in the safest wickiups. Grace felt her blood turn to ice water as she recognized Sheriff Morrison at the head of the approaching group, followed by Mayor Caldwell, Dr. Hamilton, and at least 20 heavily armed townspeople. Behind them rode a second group she didn't recognize, rough-looking men with the hard faces of hired guns or territorial rangers. "Chief Delche," she said urgently, "whatever they think has happened, let me speak to them first. I can—" "No," the Apache leader replied firmly. "You have already risked too much for my people. This danger is ours to face." The riders thundered into the camp in a cloud of dust and barely controlled violence, their horses dancing nervously as Sheriff Morrison raised his hand to halt the group. His face was grim with worry and something else. The kind of desperate determination that came from a father fearing for his child's life. "Chief Delche," Morrison called out, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "My son Billy is missing. He was last seen fishing near your camp yesterday evening. We've searched all night, and there's no sign of him anywhere." Grace felt relief wash over her as she realized this wasn't the immediate attack she had feared, but that relief was quickly replaced by dread as she saw the suspicious looks on the faces of the armed men. A missing white child near an Apache camp was exactly the kind of situation that could explode into deadly violence. Chief Delche stepped forward with the dignity that never seemed to leave him, even in the face of armed accusation. "Sheriff Morrison, no Apache has harmed your son. We do not make war on children." Mayor Caldwell, his face flushed with anguish and anger, pushed his horse forward. "Delche, Billy was fishing alone on the creek. Your warriors could have taken him without anyone seeing. We want him back, and we want him back now." One of the unknown riders, a man with a deputy marshal's badge and the kind of scarred face that spoke of a violent life, spurred his horse closer to the group. "Chief, I'm Deputy Marshal Crawford, from the territorial capital. I've been sent to investigate reports of illegal medical practice and unauthorized tribal relations. Now we've got a missing white child. This situation is about to get very serious." Grace stepped forward before Chief Delche could respond, her mind racing as she tried to find a way to prevent the confrontation from escalating into bloodshed. "Marshal Crawford, I'm Grace Morgan, the midwife who has been treating Chief Delche's son. I can vouch for the character of these people. They would never harm a child." Crawford's cold eyes fixed on her with the kind of predatory attention that made Grace's skin crawl. "Miss Morgan, you're exactly who I came here to see. You've been practicing surgery without a license, treating tribal members in violation of territorial medical regulations, and now you're interfering with a criminal investigation." Before Grace could respond, a commotion erupted from the group of Apache women near the creek. White Dove was calling out urgently in Apache, gesturing towards something downstream. Chief Delche immediately strode toward his mother, followed by the other Apache men and reluctantly by the townspeople. What they found along the creek bank made Grace's heart sink with dread. There, caught on a fallen log in the swift running water, was Billy Hutchins' fishing pole and a torn piece of his shirt, but there was no sign of the boy himself. "Dear God," Sheriff Morrison whispered, his face going pale as he stared at the evidence of his son's fate. He must have fallen in the creek. The current is strong here. He could have been swept downstream for miles. Deputy Marshal Crawford, however, was studying the scene with the suspicious eye of a man who saw conspiracy everywhere. Convenient that the evidence just happens to be found right here by the Apache camp. How do we know the boy wasn't taken, and this scene staged to cover it up? Chief Delshay's warriors stirred angrily at the accusation, and Grace could see that the situation was moments away from exploding into violence. But before anyone could speak, young Ponce stepped forward from the group of Apache children, his face serious beyond his years. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. "I saw the white boy yesterday," Ponce said in careful English, his voice carrying clearly in the tense silence. "He was fishing alone when the sun was low. He caught many fish and was happy. But then he tried to reach a big fish that was caught on the log, and the bank gave way under him." Every eye turned to the young Apache boy as he continued his account. "I called to him in English to grab the log, but the water was too fast and too cold. He went under the water, and I could not see him anymore. I ran to tell my father, but by the time we came back with ropes, there was no sign of him." Sheriff Morrison's face went through a series of expressions: hope, despair, and finally a grim acceptance of what Ponce's words meant. "Son, why didn't you tell us this immediately?" Chief Delshay placed a protective hand on his son's shoulder. "Because he is still healing from surgery, and because he feared your people would not believe the word of an Apache child. Too often, truth is not accepted by your people." Grace felt her heart breaking as she watched Sheriff Morrison struggle with the implications of what he had just heard. His son was almost certainly dead, swept away by the swift current of Willow Creek, and the Apache people who had been accused of taking him had actually tried to save him. Deputy Marshal Crawford, however, was not ready to accept this explanation. "That's a very convenient story, Chief. A little too convenient, if you ask me. I think we need to search this camp thoroughly and question everyone who was here yesterday." The threat was clear, and Grace could see Apache hands moving toward weapons as the tension ratcheted up another notch. But before anyone could act on their anger, a new voice called out from the direction of the creek, "Help! Somebody help me!" The voice was weak and waterlogged, but unmistakably that of a young boy. Every head turned toward the sound, and Grace saw Sheriff Morrison's face transform with desperate hope. "Billy!" Morrison called out, his voice cracking with emotion. "Billy, is that you?" What followed was a frantic search along the creek bank that led to the discovery of Billy Hutchins, alive but barely conscious, clinging to a partially submerged tree root nearly half a mile downstream from where his fishing gear had been found. The boy was hypothermic, exhausted, and suffering from what appeared to be a serious head injury. Grace found herself running toward the rescue scene along with everyone else, her medical training automatically taking over as she assessed Billy's condition. The boy was in serious trouble. His lips were blue with cold, his breathing was shallow and irregular, and there was a deep gash across his forehead that was still bleeding. "Get him out of the water carefully," Grace instructed as sheriff. Morrison and two other men waded into the creek. "Don't move his head or neck too quickly. He may have spinal injuries from hitting rocks in the current." As they carefully extracted Billy from the water, Grace could see that her fears were justified. The boy was barely conscious. His body temperature was dangerously low, and the head wound was more serious than it had first appeared. Without immediate medical treatment, he could easily die from his injuries. "We need to get him to town," Immediately, Dr. Hamilton declared, pushing forward with his usual self-importance. My office has the proper equipment to treat hypothermia and head injuries. But Grace was already kneeling beside the unconscious boy, her experienced hands checking his pulse and breathing, while her mind calculated the time it would take to transport him to Red Mesa. Dr. Hamilton, he doesn't have time for the ride to town. His body temperature is too low, and this head wound needs immediate attention. Miss Morgan, Deputy Marshal Crawford said sharply, you are not licensed to practice medicine in this territory. Dr. Hamilton is the qualified physician here. Grace looked up from her examination of Billy, her green eyes blazing with a fury that surprised everyone present. Marshal Crawford, this boy is dying. In the time it takes to argue about my qualifications and transport him to town, he will be dead. Now you can arrest me for practicing medicine without a license, or you can let me save Sheriff Morrison's son's life. Choose. The challenge hung in the air like a thunderclap, and Grace could see the internal struggle playing out on Crawford's face. Here was his chance to arrest the unauthorized practitioner he had been sent to investigate, but doing so would almost certainly result in the death of a prominent citizen's child. Sheriff Morrison, who had been silent during this exchange, suddenly spoke up with the voice of a desperate father. I don't care about licenses or regulations. If Miss Morgan can save my boy's life, then that's what we're going to do. Anyone who tries to stop her will answer to me. Grace didn't wait for further discussion. Moving with the efficiency that came from years of emergency medical practice, she began issuing instructions to everyone present. I need dry blankets, a fire built immediately, and someone to boil water. Chief Delche, do you have any of that willow bark tea your women prepare? The Apache chief nodded and called out rapid instructions in his native language. Within minutes, the camp had transformed into an emergency medical facility, with Apache women bringing warm blankets and healing teas while townspeople gathered firewood and followed Grace's directions. As Grace worked to stabilize Billy's condition, warming his body gradually while cleaning and suturing the head wound, she became dimly aware that something remarkable was happening around her. Apache and white settlers were working together with a cooperation that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier, united by the common goal of saving a child's life. White Dove appeared at Grace's side with a steaming cup of herbal tea. This will help with the head pain and the sickness that comes from cold water, she said quietly. My grandmother's recipe, very old and very strong. Grace accepted the tea gratefully, recognizing in the elderly Apache woman a kindred spirit who understood that healing transcended cultural boundaries. Thank you, White Dove. Your knowledge may save this boy's life. For the next 2 hours, Grace worked over Billy Hutchins with the intensity that blocked out everything else around her. She treated his hypothermia with warming techniques, sutured his head wound with the precision that had saved Ponce's life, and monitored his breathing and pulse with the constant vigilance that emergency medicine required. As Billy's condition gradually stabilized and his breathing became stronger, Grace became aware that the entire group of townspeople and Apache were watching her work with expressions of awe and respect. Deputy Marshal Crawford stood silent and grim-faced, clearly recognizing that his mission to arrest the unauthorized practitioner had been complicated by her obvious competence. When Billy finally opened his eyes and whispered, "Papa," in a weak but clear voice, the cheer that went up from the assembled crowd included both Apache and white voices raised in celebration of life preserved. Sheriff Morrison knelt beside his son with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Billy, son, can you tell us what happened?" "I fell in the creek, Papa," the boy replied weakly but coherently. "The bank broke under me and the water was so fast and cold. But I heard someone calling to me in English, telling me to grab onto things in the water. An Indian boy's voice, I think. He saved my life. Every eye turned to Ponce, who stepped forward shyly to stand beside his father. The two boys looked at each other across the cultural divide that had seemed so insurmountable just hours earlier. "You saved his life, Grace," said to Ponce, her voice filled with admiration for the young Apache boy's courage. "You saw him fall and tried to help, then told the truth when it mattered most." Sheriff Morrison looked at Ponce with an expression that mixed gratitude, shame, and a dawning understanding of how wrong his assumptions had been. "Son, I owe you an apology. We all do. Thank you for trying to save my boy." Deputy Marshal Crawford, who had remained silent during Billy's treatment and recovery, finally stepped forward with the expression of a man who had been forced to reconsider his assumptions. "Miss Morgan, I came here to arrest you for practicing medicine without proper credentials, but what I've witnessed today suggests that perhaps our definition of proper medical care needs some revision." Grace looked up from her final check of Billy's condition, her face streaked with sweat and her hands stained with blood, but her eyes bright with the satisfaction of another life saved. "Marshal Crawford, I practice the medicine I know how to practice when people need it most. If that's a crime, then I suppose you'll have to arrest half the healers on the frontier." The deputy marshal studied her face for a long moment, then glanced around at the mixed group of Apache and townspeople who had worked together to save Billy's life. When he spoke again, his voice carried a grudging respect. "Miss Morgan, I think the territorial government is going to have to take a long, hard look at its medical licensing requirements. What happened here today suggests that skill and dedication might be more important than paperwork." As the immediate crisis passed and Billy was carefully transported back to town in the back of a wagon padded with Apache blankets, Grace realized that everything had changed once again. The missing child crisis had forced Apache and white settlers to work together, had demonstrated her medical skills to skeptical authorities, and had created bonds of mutual respect that would be difficult to break. But more than that, she had proven to herself that she was willing to risk everything, including arrest and imprisonment, to save a life when the need arose. The woman who had been rejected as a barren failure was emerging as something new and powerful, a healer who answered to no authority higher than her own conscience and her commitment to preserving life. The town hall of Red Mesa had never seen an assembly quite like the one that gathered 3 days after Billy Hutchins' rescue from Willow Creek. Word of the dramatic events had spread across the Arizona territory like wildfire, drawing not only every resident of Red Mesa, but also representatives from the territorial capital, neighboring settlements, and even a reporter from the Phoenix Herald who had ridden hard through the desert to document what he called the Apache Midwife incident. Grace stood at the back of the packed hall, her hands folded calmly in front of her, despite the churning anxiety in her stomach. She had spent the past 3 days caring for Billy, who was recovering remarkably well from his ordeal, and continuing her treatment of Ponce, whose surgical wounds had healed so completely that only thin white scars remained as evidence of his brush with death. The hearing had been called by Territorial Judge Harrison Blackthorne, a stern man in his 60s who had traveled from Phoenix specifically to address what territorial officials saw as a complex legal and political situation. Seated at the front of the hall were the key players in the drama: Sheriff Morrison with his son Billy, Chief Delche with Ponce, Mayor Caldwell, Dr. Hamilton, Deputy Marshal Crawford, and significantly, White Dove, who had insisted on attending. As a representative of Apache women, Judge Blackthorne called the proceedings to order with the kind of authority that came from 30 years of frontier jurisprudence. This hearing has been convened to address multiple serious matters: unauthorized medical practice by one Grace Morgan, irregular relations between territorial citizens and tribal peoples, and the recent incident involving the near drowning of William Hutchins. Miss Morgan, please step forward. Grace walked through the crowded hall, feeling every eye upon her, aware that the next few hours would determine not only her own fate, but potentially the future of medical practice on the frontier. As she took her place in the witness chair, she caught sight of familiar faces in the crowd. Maria Santos, the baker's wife, several of the Mexican families whose children she had delivered, and surprisingly, a group of rough-looking prospectors who had apparently ridden in from the mining camps specifically for this hearing. "Miss Morgan," Judge Blackthorne began, consulting a sheaf of papers before him, "you stand accused of practicing medicine without proper territorial licensing, performing surgical procedures outside of established medical protocols, and treating tribal members in violation of territorial regulations governing Indian affairs. How do you respond to these charges?" Grace had spent considerable time preparing for this moment, but now that it had arrived, she found herself speaking from the heart rather than from any planned defense. "Your Honor, I respond that I have used the medical knowledge passed down to me by my grandmother, augmented by my own study and experience, to save lives when and where I could. If that constitutes a crime, then I am guilty as charged." Murmur rippled through the crowd at her straightforward admission, but Judge Blackthorne raised his hand for silence. "Miss Morgan, the territorial government has established medical licensing requirements for the protection of citizens. Unauthorized practitioners can cause harm through ignorance or incompetence. What makes you believe you are qualified to perform surgery?" "Your Honor," Grace replied, her voice growing stronger as she found her footing, "I have successfully delivered over 200 children, performed emergency surgery on dozens of patients, and lost fewer lives proportionally than many licensed practitioners in the territory. My qualifications come not from a certificate on a wall, but from years of study, practice, and results." Dr. Hamilton, who had been growing increasingly agitated during Grace's testimony, suddenly stood up in his seat. "Your Honor, this is precisely the kind of dangerous thinking that territorial regulations are designed to prevent. Miss Morgan has no formal medical education, no oversight from qualified physicians, and frankly, no business treating anything more serious than a scraped knee." Judge Blackthorne fixed Dr. Hamilton with a stern look. "Doctor, you will have your opportunity to testify. Please remain seated until called." The judge then turned his attention to a different aspect of the case. "Miss Morgan, you have been treating members of Chief Delshay's tribe. Are you aware that territorial regulations require all medical treatment of tribal members to be approved? Through the Bureau of Indian Affairs." Grace felt a flash of anger at the bureaucratic absurdity of the question. "Your Honor, when Chief Delshay brought his dying son to me, I did not stop to consider territorial regulations. I saw a child who would die without immediate help, and I had the skills to provide that help. I believe any decent human being would have done the same." "Miss Morgan," the judge replied sternly, "decent intentions do not supersede territorial law. The regulations exist for important reasons: to prevent exploitation of tribal peoples, to ensure proper medical standards, and to maintain appropriate boundaries between different communities." Chief Delshay, who had been sitting silently throughout the proceedings, suddenly stood with the fluid grace that marked all his movements. "Your Honor, may I speak?" Judge Blackthorne looked surprised but nodded his consent. "Chief Delshay, you may address the court, though I should note that this is a territorial legal proceeding, not a tribal matter." The Apache leader walked to the front of the hall with the same dignity he had shown when facing down armed townspeople. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries of his people's experience with white law and justice. "Judge Blackthorne, you speak of regulations to protect my people from exploitation. But when my son was dying, your regulations would have let him die rather than allow the woman with healing knowledge to save him. You speak of proper boundaries between communities, but it was the breaking of those boundaries that saved both my son's life and the life of Sheriff Morrison's boy. The hall fell completely silent as Chief Delchay continued his testimony. In my tribe, we judge healers not by the papers they carry, but by the lives they save and the knowledge they possess. By our standards, the woman you call Grace Morgan is a great medicine woman, worthy of the highest respect. Judge Blackthorne leaned forward in his chair, clearly intrigued despite himself. Chief Delchay, while I appreciate your perspective, territorial law cannot be set aside simply because it proves inconvenient. Your Honor, Chief Delchay replied, I am not asking you to set aside your laws. I'm asking you to consider whether laws that prevent the saving of lives are just laws. Before the judge could respond, Sheriff Morrison stood up in the audience. Your Honor, if I may speak as well, Sheriff Morrison, you may address the court. Morrison walked forward, his hat in his hands and his face showing the emotional strain of the past few days. Judge Blackthorne, I came very close to losing my son 3 days ago. When we found him in that creek, dying from cold and injury, Dr. Hamilton wanted to transport him to town for proper treatment. Miss Morgan said he wouldn't survive the journey and insisted on treating him immediately, even though Deputy Marshal Crawford threatened to arrest her. The sheriff's voice grew stronger as he continued. Your Honor, if Miss Morgan had followed proper territorial regulations, my boy would be dead right now. Instead, she risked her own freedom to save his life. I don't know what your law books say about that, but I know what my heart says. She's a hero, not a criminal. A ripple of approval ran through the crowd, and Grace felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected support. But the most dramatic moment came when young Billy Hutchins himself stood up in the front row. Judge, sir, Billy said in the clear voice of a boy who had looked death in the face and survived. Miss Morgan saved my life, and Ponce tried to save me too when I fell in the creek. If you punish her for helping people, that's not fair. Judge Blackthorne studied the boy's earnest face for a long moment before turning his attention to the reporter from Phoenix. Mr. Garrison, I understand you've been documenting these events for publication. The reporter, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and sharp, intelligent eyes, stood up eagerly. Yes, Your Honor. This story has all the elements that fascinate readers: frontier medicine, cultural cooperation, life and death drama. The Phoenix Herald plans to run a full series on what we're calling the Apache Midwife Miracle. Grace winced at the sensational title, but Judge Blackthorne seemed more interested in the implications than the dramatics. Mr. Garrison, in your opinion, how would the territorial public react if this court were to punish Miss Morgan for her actions? The reporter grinned with the enthusiasm of someone who understood public sentiment. Your Honor, based on the telegrams and letters already pouring into our office, I'd say the public sees Miss Morgan as exactly the kind of frontier hero that Arizona Territory needs. Punishing her would be political suicide for anyone involved. Deputy Marshal Crawford, who had remained notably silent throughout the proceedings, finally stood to address the court. Your Honor, I was sent here to investigate unauthorized medical practice and to arrest Miss Morgan, if necessary. But what I witnessed 3 days ago has forced me to reconsider the wisdom of that mission. Judge Blackthorne raised an eyebrow. With interest. Marshal Crawford, please elaborate. Your Honor, I watched Miss Morgan risk arrest and imprisonment to save a dying child. I watched her work with Apache healers to combine their knowledge with her own. I saw her treat patients with a skill and dedication that impressed even my professional skepticism. If we arrest healers like Grace Morgan, we're sending a message that following regulations is more important than saving lives. The courtroom erupted in applause at Crawford's words, and Judge Blackthorne had to bang his gavel repeatedly to restore order. When silence finally returned, he turned his attention to the most reluctant witness. Dr. Hamilton, you have been notably critical of Miss Morgan's qualifications and methods. Please address the court with your concerns. Dr. Hamilton rose slowly, his face flushed with the uncomfortable awareness that public opinion had turned decisively against him. Your Honor, I maintain that proper medical education and licensing are essential for public safety. Miss Morgan may have been fortunate in her recent cases, but luck is not a substitute for training. Dr. Hamilton, interrupted a voice from the back of the courtroom. What about the Patterson baby? Judge Blackthorne looked up sharply. Who is speaking? An elderly Mexican woman stepped forward, her weathered face showing the determination of someone who had decided to speak truth, regardless of consequences. I am Isabella Martinez, Your Honor. Dr. Hamilton delivered my sister's baby 2 months ago. The baby died because he did not know how to turn a breech birth. Miss Morgan has delivered 6 breech babies for our families, and all lived. Before Dr. Hamilton could respond, another voice called out, What about the Connolly twins? This time it was a grizzled prospector who spoke up. Dr. Hamilton said they couldn't both live, told the father to choose which one to save. Miss Morgan delivered them both healthy, and they're strong boys today. The courtroom began to buzz with similar stories, and Grace realized that people had traveled from across the territory specifically to testify to her competence and Dr. Hamilton's failures. Judge Blackthorne banged his gavel again, but this time his expression suggested interest rather than annoyance. Order in the court, he called out. However, I would like to hear these testimonials in a more organized fashion. Will those who have direct experience with Miss Morgan's medical care please come forward? What followed was an unprecedented parade of witnesses: Mexican mothers whose children Grace had delivered safely, minors whose injuries she had treated, ranchers whose wives she had saved from difficult births, and even several prostitutes from the saloon who had received medical care from Grace when no other practitioner would treat them. Each testimony painted the same picture: a skilled, dedicated healer who worked tirelessly to save lives, who studied constantly to improve her knowledge, and who charged fair prices or sometimes worked for free when families couldn't afford proper payment. White Dove, who had been waiting patiently for her opportunity to speak, finally stood and addressed the court in her dignified voice. Judge of the white people, among my tribe, we have women who are called to be healers by the spirits themselves. These women sacrifice their own chance for children so that they can serve as guardians of other women's babies. Grace Morgan is such a woman. She has the hands of a healer and the heart of a mother to all children. The elderly Apache woman's words seemed to crystallize something in the courtroom atmosphere. Grace felt the weight of recognition settling around her, not just as a skilled practitioner, but as someone who had found her true calling despite the obstacles placed in her path. Judge Blackthorne sat in thoughtful silence for several minutes after the testimonials concluded, clearly wrestling with the legal and political implications of the case before him. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a decision that would set precedent for years to come. This court finds itself in the unusual position of weighing territorial regulations against compelling evidence of competent medical practice and heroic service to the community. Miss Morgan, you have admitted to practicing medicine without proper licensing, but the evidence suggests that your unlicensed practice has been more successful than much of the licensed practice in this territory. Grace held her breath, aware that her entire future hung on the judge's next words. Therefore, this court hereby suspends all charges against Grace Morgan pending a complete review of territorial medical licensing requirements. Furthermore, Miss Morgan is hereby granted provisional authority to continue her medical practice under the supervision of territorial health officials, with the understanding that her methods and results will be studied as part of a comprehensive reform of frontier medical regulations. The courtroom exploded in cheers and applause, but Judge Blackthorne wasn't finished. Additionally, This court recommends that the territorial government establish new protocols for emergency medical care that prioritize life-saving intervention over bureaucratic procedures. As Grace stood in the witness chair, overwhelmed by the transformation of her circumstances, she felt a hand on her shoulder. Turning, she saw Chief Delche standing beside her with the expression of quiet satisfaction. "Woman who brings life," he said, in a voice that carried across the now quiet courtroom. "You have proven that healing knows no boundaries of law or custom. My people will always honor the courage you showed in saving my son." Grace looked out at the sea of faces surrounding her, Apache and white, Mexican and Anglo, rich and poor, all united in their recognition of her worth. The Barren Midwife, who had been rejected by her own community, had become something new, a symbol of frontier medicine at its best, a bridge between cultures, and a healer whose reputation would draw patients from across the territory. But most importantly, she had proven to herself that her calling was real, that her skills mattered, and that the woman who couldn't bear children of her own had become a mother to an entire community's medical needs. 6 months after Judge Blackthorn's historic ruling, the Arizona Territory had become a different place, and nowhere was that change more evident than in the bustling medical complex that had risen on the outskirts of Red Mesa. What had once been Grace Morgan's simple cabin had expanded into a sprawling facility that served as both a hospital and a revolutionary training center for frontier medicine. Grace stood in the morning sunlight outside the main building, watching as construction workers put the finishing touches on the new wing that would house the Territorial Medical Institute, the first school in the American West designed to train healers in the practical medicine that frontier communities actually needed. The brass plaque beside the entrance read, "Morgan Medical Center, where healing knows no boundaries." The transformation had begun almost immediately after the territorial hearing. Within weeks of Judge Blackthorn's ruling, representatives from the territorial capital had arrived with funding, supplies, and most importantly, official recognition of what they now called practical emergency medicine. Grace's methods were being studied, documented, and prepared for distribution to medical schools across the frontier. Behind her, the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the arrival of the morning supply wagon from Phoenix, laden with the latest medical journals, surgical instruments ordered from back east, and herbs that White Dove had requested from Apache territories as far away as New Mexico. The weekly deliveries had become a vital lifeline, bringing both modern medical advances and traditional healing materials to the growing facility. Grace walked toward the main building, pausing to admire the garden that White Dove had established along the eastern wall. Here, traditional Apache medicinal plants grew alongside European herbs that Grace had ordered from medical catalogs, creating a living pharmacy that served both healing traditions. The sight never failed to remind her of how far they had all traveled from the suspicion and hostility that had once divided their communities. A familiar voice called out behind her, and Grace turned to see Dr. Catherine Sullivan approaching from the main building. Dr. Sullivan was one of 3 licensed physicians who had volunteered to work alongside Grace in developing the new medical protocols that were revolutionizing frontier healthcare. Unlike Dr. Hamilton, who had quietly left Red Mesa after his incompetence was publicly exposed during the hearing, these new doctors came eager to learn from Grace's experience. "Grace, the delegation from Denver just arrived," Dr. Sullivan announced, her voice carrying the excitement that had become common around the medical center. "They want to observe your surgical techniques and discuss implementing similar programs in Colorado and Wyoming. But that's not all. We've just received word that the Surgeon General himself wants to visit next month to evaluate our methods for potential adoption by military field hospitals." Grace felt a familiar thrill at the recognition her work was receiving. The medical center had become a destination for physicians, government officials, and researchers from across the nation, all eager to learn about the innovative approaches that had emerged from the collaboration between cultures. As they walked toward the main building, Grace caught sight of a familiar figure approaching on horseback. Chief Delche rode with the same quiet dignity that had impressed her 6 months earlier. But now his visits to the medical center were routine rather than desperate. Ponce, fully recovered and grown taller in the intervening months, rode beside his father with the confident bearing of a young man who had survived both serious injury and the complex politics of territorial justice. Beside them rode Nietzsche, Chief Delche's brother, who had become an unexpected advocate for the medical cooperation program. The warrior, who had once been suspicious of all white settlers, now served as a liaison between Apache communities and the medical center, helping to identify traditional healers willing to share their knowledge. "Chief Delche," Grace called out as the Apache leader dismounted. "I wasn't expecting you until this afternoon." The chief smiled, an expression that had become much more common since the events that had brought them together. The delegation of tribal leaders arrived early. They are eager to see the place, where Apache knowledge and white medicine work together, but we also bring news from the reservation. 3 more tribes have agreed to send their medicine people to learn from what we have built here. Grace felt a familiar flutter of nervous excitement. Today's gathering represented something unprecedented in the history of the American frontier. A formal conference between territorial medical officials and Apache tribal healers, designed to create the first comprehensive medical system that incorporated both Western medical techniques and traditional Native American healing wisdom. The idea had emerged from the collaboration between Grace and White Dove during the critical days following Ponce's surgery. As the 2 women had shared their knowledge of healing herbs, surgical techniques, and the treatment of various ailments, they had discovered that their different traditions were remarkably complementary. White Dove's encyclopedic knowledge of desert plants and their medicinal properties had proven invaluable in treating conditions that Western medicine struggled with, while Grace's surgical skills and understanding of anatomy had saved lives that traditional healing could not reach. Inside the main building, the scene was unlike anything the Arizona Territory had ever witnessed. The large conference room buzzed with animated conversation as Apache medicine men, territorial health officials, Mexican curanderas, and licensed physicians shared knowledge, compared techniques, and debated the merits of different approaches to healing. At one end of the room, Dr. James Whitman from the University of Pennsylvania sketched detailed diagrams as an elderly Apache healer named Running Bear explained the preparation of a pain-killing salve made from cactus extracts. At the other end, Grace demonstrated suturing techniques to a group of fascinated traditional healers while discussing how their herbal antiseptics could improve surgical outcomes. At the center of it all sat White Dove, now officially recognized as the medical center's senior consultant on traditional healing. Her presence had been controversial at first. Some territorial officials had balked at the idea of consulting with Apache healers, but her knowledge had proven so valuable that she was now regularly consulted on difficult cases that stumped conventional medicine. Grace took her place at the head of the long table, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with her new role as Director of Frontier Medical Services. The title had been created specifically for her by the territorial government, acknowledging that her unique combination of skills, cultural knowledge, and proven results made her irreplaceable in the evolving landscape of Western medicine. "Ladies and gentlemen," Grace began, her voice carrying the confidence that had developed over months of successful collaboration, We gather today to formalize the protocols that will guide medical practice throughout the Southwestern Territories. Our goal is simple: to save as many lives as possible using every tool, technique, and tradition at our disposal. She gestured to a series of charts that lined the walls, each one documenting the remarkable success rates achieved through their integrated approach. In the 6 months since we began this collaboration, our surgical mortality rate has dropped to less than 5%, compared to the territorial average of nearly 30%. Our maternal mortality rate is the lowest recorded in any frontier territory, and we have successfully treated diseases that conventional medicine considers incurable. The presentation that followed was a testament to how much had changed since the desperate night when Chief Delche had ridden into Red Mesa with his dying son. Grace demonstrated surgical techniques that incorporated traditional Apache pain management methods, while White Dove explained how desert plants could prevent the infections that killed so many surgical patients. Dr. Margaret Chen, the Territorial Health Commissioner who had traveled from Phoenix for the conference, leaned forward with obvious fascination as Grace described a recent case. "Miss Morgan, are you telling us that the Apache willow bark preparation is more effective than morphine for post-surgical pain management?" "In many cases, yes," Grace replied, gesturing to White Dove. "The traditional preparation doesn't carry the risk of addiction that we see with morphine, and it seems to promote healing rather than simply masking pain. We've documented over 200 cases where patients recovered faster and with fewer complications using traditional pain management." White Dove nodded gravely. "Our grandmothers learned over many generations which plants help the body heal itself. We do not fight the body's wisdom, we support it. The white medicine is strong for cutting and mending, but the old medicine knows how to make the spirit strong again." Dr. Sullivan stood and addressed the group with the enthusiasm of a convert. "6 months ago, I would have dismissed such claims as superstition, but working here has opened my eyes to the limitations of conventional medical education. We've been so focused on disease that we've forgotten about health." The discussion continued for hours, covering everything from battlefield surgery techniques that Grace had developed to traditional birthing practices that reduced maternal mortality rates. Most remarkable was the spirit of cooperation that had developed between practitioners who 6 months earlier would never have spoken to each other. During a break in the formal proceedings, Grace found herself on the porch of the medical center. With Chief Delche and Ponce, the young Apache man had become something of a celebrity in his own right, the boy whose near death had sparked a revolution in frontier medicine. More importantly, he had become a bridge between worlds, equally comfortable speaking Apache with the tribal elders and English with the visiting doctors. "Miss Grace," Ponce said in the English that had become fluent over the past months, "my father says you are writing a book about healing." Grace smiled at the earnest young man who had grown into someone who moved easily between Apache and Anglo worlds. "I'm working on a medical manual that will teach other doctors and healers how to combine traditional and modern techniques. Your recovery will be one of the case studies, but more than that, your story shows how healing can bring people together." Chief Delche looked out over the bustling medical complex with satisfaction. "You have built something important here, woman who brings life. This place heals more than bodies. It heals the divisions between peoples. My son's injury brought us together, but your courage and wisdom made us family." The truth of his observation was evident everywhere Grace looked. The medical center employed Apache, Mexican, and Anglo staff working side by side. Patients from across the territory came seeking treatment that combined the best of all medical traditions. Most importantly, the success of the collaboration had begun to change attitudes throughout the Southwest. A commotion near the main building drew their attention, and Grace saw a familiar stagecoach pulling up with official territorial markings. From it emerged a distinguished woman in formal dress who carried herself with unmistakable authority, followed by several men in military uniforms. "Dr. Elizabeth Morrison," Grace said with surprise, recognizing the woman who had become the first female territorial health inspector. "I wasn't expecting her until tomorrow." "And those are Army medical officers," Dr. Morrison approached with the brisk efficiency that had made her famous throughout the medical community. "Miss Morgan, I apologize for arriving early, but I couldn't wait to see the results of your latest innovations. These gentlemen are from the Army Medical Corps. They're here to evaluate your methods for use in military field hospitals." Major Thomas Bradley, a weathered soldier with the bearing of someone who had seen too much battlefield medicine, stepped forward with obvious interest. "Miss Morgan, we've heard remarkable reports about your survival rates and techniques. The Army is always looking for better ways to treat wounded soldiers in remote locations." Grace led the official delegation through the medical center, proud to show off the advances that had been made. The surgical suite now rivaled any hospital in the major cities, while the traditional healing wing provided treatments that were attracting patients from as far away as California and Texas. In the children's ward, Grace paused to check on her youngest patients, twin boys born prematurely, whose lives had been saved through a combination of traditional Apache warming techniques and modern medical intervention. Their mother, a young Mexican woman named Carmen, looked up from her bedside vigil with tears of gratitude. "Senora Morgan," Carmen whispered, "the doctors in Tucson said my babies would die. But here, with the old medicine and the new medicine, together they grow strong. My husband says we will name one boy Delshay and one boy Morgan to honor the healing that saved them." Grace knelt beside the woman, checking the baby's breathing and color with the practiced eye that had saved so many lives. "Carmen, your boys are fighters. They'll be home with you soon." Major Bradley watched the interaction with obvious amazement. "Miss Morgan, how do you achieve such remarkable results with premature infants?" "Traditional Apache warming techniques combined with careful monitoring," Grace explained. "The Apache have been keeping premature babies alive in harsh conditions for centuries. We've simply added modern medical support to their time-tested methods." Dr. Morrison watched the interaction with obvious amazement. "Miss Morgan, what you've accomplished here is remarkable. The Territorial Medical Board wants to establish similar centers throughout the Southwest, with you overseeing the entire program. And if Major Bradley's evaluation is positive, the Army wants to implement your techniques in field hospitals across the frontier." Grace felt a thrill of excitement at the possibilities such expansion would create. Frontier communities across the West were struggling with the same medical challenges that Red Mesa had faced: isolation, limited resources, and practitioners who weren't trained for the realities of frontier life. As the delegation continued their tour, Grace caught sight of Dr. Hamilton's replacement, Dr. James Richardson, working alongside an Apache healer to treat a mining accident victim. The cooperation that had once seemed impossible had become routine, and the results spoke for themselves. The medical center's mortality rates were lower than any comparable facility in the territory. The formal conference concluded that evening with a signing ceremony that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Territorial officials, Apache tribal leaders, Mexican community representatives, and licensed physicians all put their names to a document establishing the Southwest Medical Cooperation Protocol, the first formal agreement in American history, to integrate traditional Native American healing practices with conventional Western medicine. As Grace signed her name to the historic document, she reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. The woman who had been dismissed as a barren failure was now being consulted by medical authorities from across the nation. Her techniques were being taught in medical schools. Her innovations were saving lives throughout the frontier. And most importantly, she had found a way to honor both her grandmother's traditional knowledge and the surgical skills she had developed through necessity. Sheriff Morrison, who had become one of Grace's strongest supporters, approached her with Billy. At his side, the boy had grown taller and stronger in the months since his rescue, and his friendship with Ponce had become a symbol of the cultural bridge building that Grace's work had inspired. "Miss Grace," Sheriff Morrison said warmly, "I wanted to thank you again for everything you've done for our community. Billy's been telling everyone at school about his Apache friend and the amazing things happening at the medical center." Billy nodded enthusiastically. "Miss Grace, Ponce and I have been thinking we want to study medicine when we're older. We want to work here at the medical center and help people like you do." Grace felt her heart swell with pride and hope. These boys represented the future, a generation that would grow up seeing cooperation between cultures as normal rather than revolutionary. Chief Delche approached her after the ceremony, carrying a beautifully crafted wooden box. "Woman who brings life, my people have a gift for you." Inside the box, nestled in soft deer hide, was an exquisite silver necklace featuring traditional Apache designs combined with medical symbols. The centerpiece was a turquoise stone carved in the shape of healing hands, surrounded by intricate engravings that told the story of Ponce's rescue and recovery. "It is made by our finest craftsmen," Chief Delche explained. "But the design comes from White Dove, who says it represents the union of all healing traditions in your hands. She has spent many weeks working with the silversmiths to ensure that every symbol has meaning." Grace felt tears well up as she touched the beautiful necklace. "Chief Delche, this is too precious. No gift is too precious for the woman who saved my son and brought peace between our peoples," the Apache leader replied solemnly. "Wear it as a reminder that true healing respects no boundaries." As the celebration continued around them, Grace stepped outside to look up at the stars that shone so brilliantly in the clear desert sky. 6 months ago, she had been a lonely woman, fighting for recognition in a hostile community. Tonight, she stood at the center of a revolution in frontier medicine, surrounded by colleagues who respected her knowledge and friends who valued her courage. A gentle hand on her shoulder interrupted her thoughts, and she turned to see White Dove standing beside her with the serene expression that had become so familiar. "You are thinking deep thoughts, daughter of healing," the elderly Apache woman observed. Grace smiled at the affectionate title that White Dove had begun using. "I'm thinking about how much has changed and wondering what comes next." White Dove nodded thoughtfully. "My grandmother used to say that the spirits choose some people to be rivers. They carve new paths through the landscape and change everything they touch. You are such a river, Grace Morgan, but even rivers need time to rest and appreciate the beautiful country they have created." As if summoned by their conversation, Ponce and Billy Hutchins appeared together, their faces flushed with excitement. From the evening's festivities, behind them came Naiche, carrying a young Apache girl who had fallen asleep during the ceremonies. "Miss Grace," Billy called out excitedly, "Ponce and I have been talking with the other boys, and we want to start a school here at the medical center, a place where Apache and white children can learn together about healing and medicine." Ponce nodded enthusiastically. "We could teach both languages, both ways of healing. Maybe someday there won't be Apache medicine and white medicine, just medicine that helps people." Grace looked at the two young men, one Apache, one Anglo, both shaped by the events that had brought them together, and saw the future of frontier medicine. These boys would grow up in a world where cultural cooperation in healing was normal rather than revolutionary, where the best of all medical traditions would be combined to serve human need. "Boys," Grace said warmly, "I think that's a wonderful idea. The medical center will always need healers who understand that medicine is about more than just techniques. It's about bringing people together to fight suffering and death. As the stars wheeled overhead and the celebration gradually wound down, Grace felt a deep sense of completion. The Barren Midwife, who had been rejected by her community, had become the mother of a new kind of medicine, one that honored all healing traditions and served all people regardless of race or culture. Major Bradley approached her one final time before departing. "Miss Morgan, I'll be recommending immediate implementation of your protocols in Army medical facilities. What you've achieved here could save thousands of soldiers' lives." Grace nodded, understanding the weight of responsibility that came with such recognition. "Major Bradley, the techniques we've developed here work because they're based on respect. Respect for different traditions, respect for each patient's needs, and respect for the healing wisdom that exists in every culture." The woman who couldn't bear children had given birth to something far more lasting than any individual life. She had created a legacy of healing that would serve the frontier for generations to come. And in the process, she had proven that sometimes the greatest gifts come not from what we can do for ourselves, but from what we're willing to sacrifice to serve others. Standing under the vast Arizona sky, surrounded by friends who had once been strangers and colleagues who had once been enemies, Grace Morgan knew that she had found her true calling. She was no longer the useless, barren midwife of Red Mesa. She was the woman who brought life, who healed divisions, and who had shown the frontier that the best medicine came from the courage to trust in healing wherever it might be found. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.